at the time, there was this huge task force together bent on taking down the entire Juarez cartel, and it involved FBI, DEA, and ICE. But the problem was they all were competing with each other. They didn't share information. It was like a big, can I say the word cluster?
Yeah, you can say whatever you want here.
Yeah, it was a big, it was like a cluster form.
Welcome to Fight Back Radio, a production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggle. And today we have a little bit of a different type of show. We have an investigative journalist, Bill Conroy, will be joining us, and it's different than often we have people from the movement that we're raising up different aspects of what organizers and people are doing. But this is more how do you look at and dig into the truth of matters, which really matter. I mean, if you're gonna have an opinion about things, you have to have a material, objective analysis of what's going on in the world, and having news that you can where people can dig in and find out and are willing to do those kinds of things is so important to us, and it's become so much more precious in these days as newspapers and others dwindle down so much stuff. And Bill has spent a career digging into and being an investigative journalist and finding out things that the government and others didn't want us to know. So welcome to Fight Back Radio, Bill.
Hey, glad to be here, Richard.
Yeah, it's good to have you.
Thanks for having me. And hello to all your listeners.
Okay, all right. So let's get into it. I mean, you wrote a book that's called Dispatches from the House of Death, and its subtitle tells a lot about it. It says a Juarez cartel informant, a DEA whistleblower, mass murder and cover up on the edge of empire. And I think I just said to you, it sounds like a Halloween thriller more than anything else. But this is a story that really happened, and something that you've dug into to show and to prove that it really happened. So let's get into it a little bit. The story centers around an ICE informant. ICE is Immigration Customs Enforcement, a guy named Guillermo Eduardo Ramirez Pedro. And could you tell us just a little bit about who this guy is? And he was an ICE informant, but also he worked for the cartels, et cetera. But how do you get caught up with all this stuff? And who is this guy?
Yeah, well, he's admittedly to me anyway, a fascinating character, even if what he did is pretty gruesome. He essentially, unlike what you would suspect, he grew up in a middle class Mexican family. So he grew up with some money. His parents were civil engineers, and he had extended family in the construction business, and that comes up in the book too at the end as to what the nature of that business was. But he got into the drug trade, like happens a lot in Mexico. The lines between government, law enforcement, and organized crime, it's all meshed together, right? The organized crime is embedded in law enforcement, in the government, in the business community. And the truth be told, if we look hard on this side of the border in the US, we see the same thing. We have a candidate for president that has been accused of various things related to money laundering and so forth. So it's not unique to Mexico. It just manifests itself different. So Ramirez Pero started out, he called himself, because I interviewed him multiple times, kind of the black sheep of his family, right? He was never going to be happy in a traditional role. So he went to become a Mexican cop. At the time, it was a federal highway cops. They banded that agency, if you will. Over time, Mexico does that a lot. They'll dissolve their law enforcement agencies that become too corrupt and restart a new one that eventually ends up down the same way. That's happening over and over. So he started out as a federal cop, and he got into the drug business through that, and also extended family connections. Which he doesn't. He's very coy about what that is for various obvious reasons, but that's the truth. So he started, if you read his and all this is documented either in the immigration courts or FOIA records or interviews with this guy, and they all triangulate and come out the same. So he was helping, to allow loads come in off of, he says, the Mexican Navy was involved at that time under the Fox administration in Mexico and bringing up cocaine because the cocaine will come from South America. It's not produced in Mexico and then offloaded and then, distributed. Mexico's the transport country to get it up to the plazas on the border. And then from those plazas like Juarez, which is what I focused on, Laredo, Tijuana, it gets brought into the United States, carved up, brought in, with corruption on our side. They usually find some kind of border patrol person that they dirty up that will let the loads pass. That's one of the main ways they do it. And they're very skilled at it. It's just a business, it happens regularly. So that's how he got started. He claims then at one time, at some point, he got a pain of conscience about all this and walked across the border and wanted to become an informant. And the first agents he ran into were ICE. So he ran into an ICE agent and brought him in, said, wow, we can cultivate this guy to get inside the Juarez cartel because he was already in it. And so, and so they hired him and certified him and did all the paperwork to make him an informant. And all the agencies were using him for a time. This is about 2000 when he got cultivated as an informant. So FBI, DEA, and ICE. And a lot of times they didn't know. I mean, one agency didn't know he was an informant for the other. In fact, DEA didn't realize ICE was running him as an informant initially and actually opened an investigation on him. So he was the target of a DEA investigation at the same time. He was an ICE informant, and that didn't come out until later. And then DEA put him on the payroll and ultimately dropped him after he got caught running a load of marijuana across the border in New Mexico. And the ICE agents and ICE leadership went to a friendly U.S. attorney in El Paso, because Juarez is right across the border, and got those charges dismissed so they could keep running him as an informant. They paid this guy like $250,000, and he says he's owed more. And he had all kinds of side businesses going that are suspect at the very time he was an informant for ICE. So what they say in the business is this guy was playing, was handling his ICE agents more than they were handling him. One of them even said this guy is so sharp and slick and he is very, very intelligent, and he's like kind of charismatic figure. He's about 6'2", 6'3", good looking, and kind of comes across as soft spoken and just very razor sharp intellect. They told me that the mistake they made is letting him into the office, seeing how all the law enforcement operates on this side of the border, because at some point he's going to go back to Mexico and become in the leadership of one of these cartels. And he's that was one of the regrets that one of the agents had about all this. But so the long and short of it is he was always part of the cartel. And the cartel's a wrong word in many ways to use. It's in the press up here so much it's hard to reinvent it. But there is no one cartel. I mean, it's just they're organized crime groups, and they're not built in some kind of hierarchical structure. It's a bunch of affinity groups. So there's street gangs that align with some of these. They have to pick one, or they're going to be targeted by all of them. So they pick one of the organized crime groups to attach to. But they'll freelance too. They're not always doing work for that cartel. But when the cartel wants something done, they all line up, including the corrupt police, the corrupt politicians, the street gangs. That's why they're so deadly and efficient. And at this point in time, when I was covering this story initially back in 2004 up through, I covered it all the way up through, the year the book came out, which was last year. But the Juarez Plaza was controlled by what they call the Juarez cartel. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes was the ostensible top guy there, but there was a whole organization structure that kind of kept all this in order. But at any given time there's internal schisms within the cartel. People, they're all alpha males for the most part, who are all want to be the leader or the top guy, and they all know they got a short lifespan, and they're lethal in their approach, because this is organized
No,
crime.
I get it. Yeah, no, it's not, it's whatever. It's a dangerous life. Let
Yeah,
me circle back here a little bit though. To the book focuses on a number of things, but the thing you really dig into is this what's called the House of Death. And at the time that Ramirez Pedro was on the ICE and maybe other government agency payrolls, he was also part of the cartel and was involved with this House of Death. Could you talk a little bit about what is the House of Death, and what and Ramirez Pedro reports all the things that happen there, many of them anyways, to his handlers in the United States at ICE. And so could you talk a little bit about what actually happened there, and why it's disturbing, at least to me, that somebody that's an employee of the United States government is involved in this kind of thing.
yeah, and that is the crux of it. Before, like, everyone looks at Mexico now and says, "Oh yeah, there's all kinds of violence," and clearly there is. But there was back then. It just wasn't quite as much in the open. So what the cartels did, because they wanted to keep their enforcement side kind of out of the public media, is if somebody crossed the cartel, like the city of Juarez, the Juarez Plaza, as they called it, was controlled by one cartel at the time, the Juarez cartel, and anybody moving drugs through the plaza, which was the major entry point to the United States, had to pay tribute of some sort to the Juarez cartel leadership. And if they didn't, these are the guys they scooped up off the street if they found them moving drugs without their permission, and they'd kill them. But they would murder them either wherever they found them, or they would bring them to this particular house and torture them to get the information they needed, and then murder them in a pretty gruesome way, and then bury them in the backyard. The House of Death, I discovered, followed where Ramirez Payroll ran it. The ICE informant was in charge of that house. He was in charge of opening up for the murders, for burying the body, making sure the bodies got buried, and even bringing people to the house. And they were murdered by Mexican cops. There was a whole 13 night shift state police under one commander who was, and there were more groups like this, but this is the one associated with this house who would come in. Some of them, or all of them. There was as many as 13 cops there, and one involved in one murder, where they brought two guys in who had messed up, bringing loads across the border, and the cartel decided they're going to kill them. And they brought him in, and put bags over their heads and knelt them down. And the head of the state commander of the police there, shot each of them, put a silencer on, boom, boom, right in front of everyone, after intimidating the hell out of them. And there were innocent people murdered too. Like one guy had discovered a warehouse full of marijuana, and he reported it to the federal cops. And the federal cops in Juarez told, of course, the cartel. And the cartel brought this guy in and murdered him, because they didn't want him running around talking about warehouses full of dope that were going to cross the border. So this is the kind of operation it was. And when we went and visited it at the time, two other houses popped up within a mile and a half of the same house. There were at least 12 bodies found in the backyard of the House of Death that the informant ran. The other two houses, when you combine all the bodies, there was 55 bodies, and that's just the ones that we discovered. And since then, as you know, they call them narcophoses. It's like mass graves with bodies. Those pop up all the time in Mexico. They're not even a surprise anymore. But back then, nobody knew how this really worked, and it was pretty dangerous to cover. Admittedly, looking back at it at my age now, what I was doing then. I was probably a little naive, a little bit, but it didn't take long for me to figure out it was dangerous territory. And so that's that. I can't say any more about it. It was. And that was the house. So we had an ICE informant paid by ICE, and he was running a mass murder machine, helping to run a mass murder machine for the cartel in Juarez, and reporting back this to his ICE handlers. In fact, the informant participated in the first murder at the house of the death, and some estimates say he was present for at least half a dozen of them. But the first one was the one that he recorded it. He brought it back to ICE, and basically they said, "Don't record any more murders."
So they had an actual recording of a murder by their employee, and then and what did they do? What did they do when they got this?
They told them, stop recording, just go back there and do what you're supposed to do, which was bury the bodies, and then keep going. Because they were very intent. At the time, there was this huge task force together bent on taking down the entire Juarez cartel, and it involved FBI, DEA, and ICE. But the problem was they all were competing with each other. They didn't share information. It was like a big, can I say the word cluster?
Yeah, you can say whatever you want here.
It was like a clusterfuck. And so DEA didn't know what ICE was doing. ICE withheld information from DEA, FBI, nobody, they were off trying to get targets in Europe when everyone was focused here. And so it was a mess, right? The way I look at it, it was a mess. And it's no wonder this happened because, nobody was kind of paying attention, kept their eye on the ball. Like, we do have laws here. See, the irony of it is, if you murder someone in Mexico, it's not against US law, it's against Mexican law, but 1% of the murders in Mexico even get investigated. So the odds of getting away with murder in Mexico, which is why the murder rate's so high, is because of the integrity of the system there. Unfortunately, it's pretty high. So there's a lot of impunity to murder people. So they weren't really worried, and they lied to the Mexican government. They said their informant witnessed a murder. And meanwhile, the Mexican government, the elements that were legit, because there are legitimate elements, but they're always wondering who's in the cartel, who's not. It's like a big spy game. You don't know. And they were busy dealing with other things. They didn't care about a murder in Juarez. They had, Nuevo Laredo just had a bunch of federal Mexican cops killed by cartel gun battles. So they weren't focused on this. So they just kept going with the investigation with the goal of, making a big case that makes big headlines here, and everyone's career gets boosted. You get bigger, the way the US system works, if your agency or your unit is doing, getting a lot of busts and a lot of arrest statistics, you get your budget's bigger, right? Because you're doing good work and you get positive headlines, and they work on that because that's a political thing. If you're a US attorney with your eye on running for office, you want headlines, you want good headlines. An example of that, more current, is what happened with the arrest of the head of the Juarez Sinaloa cartel recently. A guy named El Mayo is what he goes by, Zambada. And for years, him and El Chapo ran the Sinaloa cartel. Well, he basically got renditioned into the U.S. and arrested here. And that was a huge headline. And if you go back and read the headlines, it's going to stop fentanyl from getting into the U.S. This is a major victory in the drug war. Well, if you look what happened, fentanyl is still coming into the U.S. at the same rate it was, if not more. All it did by taking down the head of the Juarez cartel, which was already kind of fractured, is create a lot of mini cartels. They call it Sol Dragonstein. So the violence, if you read now, go check out the Mexican news, the violence is spiked again because of this. So every time we do something up here with the drug war, the repercussions in Mexico usually is more death and murder. And this is the relationship that's been going on since Nixon started this thing, right? So anyway, back to the informant. He's actually committing murder on the payroll of the US government. And the US government's response was to try to cover it up so it didn't interfere with these cases they were making. The informant, they couldn't allow the informant to become public, number one, because they'd have to shut down, pull them out and go to trial with the cases they had that were half finished. They actually had enough to arrest a guy that was running the house of death, that was really in charge, and that the informant worked for, a guy named Santillan. They had enough to arrest him before the first murder, but they wanted to get him on murder, and they wanted to keep the informant inside the cartel to get more information and make more cases. But once he was exposed in any one of these cases, because they would have to put him on the stand, or even if he was a non-testifier, which he would have been, his work would have came out, right? So they had to keep this, away from the public eye and away from any of the attorneys that would be defending these people. And so that's what.
Let me ask you then about that, because there's a guy who foiled some of their plans. A guy named Sandalio Gonzalez, who was a whistleblower, and some of his actions are things that you uncovered and were able to were able to start to figure out how all the things you're saying now. Could you tell us a little bit about Sandy goes by, I understand, or could you tell me a little bit about him and how that maybe foiled some of this attempts to use this guy and keep secret things that that they didn't want to come to light that you exposed?
Yeah, well, Sandy really, he wasn't your traditional whistleblower. He tried to do all this through agency channels. So what happened is Sandy originally, his life story is he immigrated from Cuba, as part of the Pedro Pan exodus there. And he ended up being separated from his parents because of that for a couple of years and lived with relatives and, spent time in New York and LA. And he says he got interested in law enforcement because when he was in New York, he was home alone and some guy broke in and tried to rob the place and he ran out and some cop chased the guy down. That's his story on why he got involved in law enforcement to do good, right? That kind of thing. And he ended up being one of the highest ranking Latinos in DEA. He was DEA. He started out in local law enforcement, joined DEA.
So it's a drug enforcement agency.
Right. Ran a lot of their Latin American operations, was very high up there. So he understood, what the drug war was south of the border. And then he was became the second in command of Miami, which was, the biggest DEA office, particularly on the drug war front at the time. And he was on his way up. But there he ran into corruption and he blew the whistle on it, which was some local cops that allegedly, possibly with the cooperation of some crooked DEA agents, stole some cocaine from a bus, but there were some kilos missing. And they tried to blame it on an informant, and Sandy knew that wasn't true. And so he caused a stink about it. Well, the way they dealt with that is they gave him a promotion to El Paso, which is like the edge of the empire, hence the name of the book, right? It's like nobody wanted to be in El Paso, especially with DEA. So it was really a demotion disguised as a promotion. And that's where he ran into this shit, right? The House of Death. And he didn't go to the media. What he did is he wrote a letter to his counterpart at ICE. What triggered the letter is over the course of half a year or so, from August of 2003 to January of 2004, there were multiple murders, and it kept getting worse and worse to the point where this cell of the Juarez cartel that the informant was part of targeted a DEA agent and his family in Juarez. They were there. They have a contingent of DEA or did in Juarez to kind of do information gathering. They didn't have arrest powers. They couldn't do any of that, but they're basically undercover, right? But they thought this guy was crooked, and they brought three guys to the House of Death, tortured them, and one of them gave out the address to this DEA agent. And I don't want to give away the whole book, but you'll find out why he did it in the book and why it makes sense that this DEA agent was targeted for being corrupt when he wasn't, depending on your definition of corrupt. And they went to his house, and his wife was there with her two kids, and she knew enough not to answer the door, called him, and he came back from the embassy and grabbed them up and was trying to drive them back to safety in the embassy. And they got pulled over in the middle of the street in Juarez by Juarez cop and Juarez enforcers, and they were likely going to be killed, right? Taken somewhere and killed. That was the fear. But the DEA agent was smart enough to call the embassy, and they got someone over there really quick, another DEA agent. And anyway, it got settled. And then the Santillan, the head of the house of death or ran that, called the informant, and the informant kind of talked him off the cliff. Don't go after these guys. So in a weird way, the informant saved their lives. But that completely freaked DEA out. They didn't know how exposed the rest of the agents, because their families are there. They didn't know what the threat level. So they had to evacuate all the DEA agents from Juarez because of this messed up ICE operation that was allowing murder to happen. And it almost cost the lives of DEA agents. And if you go back to Kiki Camarena, they got a sore spot about that. Kiki Camarena back in the 80s was tortured and murdered by assets that people believed at the time.
So these are two government agencies who are basically not talking. And this is, am I right? This is at a time when Homeland Security was taking over all of it, right? Around that time, maybe I'm wrong, but it's
no, you're right. Homeland Security had just been established. ICE was brand new. They had, they wanted to make a name for themselves. That all feeds into it. You're right. And that agents, there were all kinds of turf wars, because they all wanted credit for this stuff, right? And that credit translates to money and promotions and careerism. That's how it's set up. And so so this was ICE essentially created these dynamics that led to the DEA agents almost getting murdered and having to evacuate them all. And they put them up in El Paso. Sandy had to overlook all this. And he was hearing from, earfuls of how full of crap this is, and this has to be shut down and exposed. So he wrote, with the permission of his superior, wrote a letter to his ICE counterpart in El Paso, complaining about this homicidal informant they were using and how this was, unnecessary murders, and this is just, way over the top. And that letter got CC'd to the U.S. attorney in charge of Texas, Western Texas, and this case that they were trying to build this big multi-task force thing. And he went through the ceiling. And that's when they went, and, how I found out through FOIA that, the head of DEA said, we got to, work on making sure this doesn't get into the media, take all the steps. And then I'll talk to the DEA commander, meaning Sandy, and, basically read him the riot act. And Sandy ended up getting threatened with demotions and a bad review and et cetera. Basically, he got blackballed and essentially forced. He wasn't ordered to retire, but it was like he at every turn his career was stymied, and he was being, kind of, if you will, persecuted by the people above who were pissed off at him. And
so he was, he did, this is interesting though, because he did all the right things. He even asked his boss before he sent the letter, according to you, right? And so he was just saying, look, our guys were almost killed in Juarez, and this guy was, and this messed up a whole operation, and you need to straighten shit out. Am I right about that, or?
Yeah, essentially, I think that was his hope. But what happened is it all got turned back on him, and he was accused of, inflaming a situation that they already had under control, et cetera, et cetera. And so the only reason we know about it in the letter at all is I got it through the Freedom of Information Act. I probably shouldn't have. I mean, whoever was vetting stuff at the time let it slip through, I suspect, because it was, a pretty explosive letter, but I got it. And we went to press with it, and it kind of blew everything up. Within weeks of us publishing all this, the informant, for other reasons too, because he was involved in another murder. The book is complicated, I'll admit, but at the same time, everything that was going on with Sandy, the informant was, scooped up, brought to San Antonio, and then he snuck out of San Antonio to try to do another deal that ended up getting someone else murdered at a fast food restaurant in El Paso. So anyway, they scooped him up, put him deep sixed him so no one could get near him, including the press. And, we're trying to deport him. ICE was essentially. So, and the informant said, if I get deported, I'm going to get murdered because I'm an informant. I'm outed. And they didn't really care. That's his big line through all of this is the U.S. government, what they're trying to cover up isn't the fact that they allowed this to happen and allowed the House of Death to happen. Is they're trying to cover up the fact they didn't care about it. They didn't care that people got murdered in Mexico. And Sandy kind of echoes that too. He says this would never have happened on the Canadian border. U.S. law enforcement, or in general, the American people would not have stood for it, but because it happened, in Juarez, and it involved a bunch of Mexicans, they didn't give a shit. And I think there's
good. I mean, it sounds right, actually, to me too. To be honest with you, I mean, it's clearly there's a racism involved in how the United States treats other countries. And
but anyway, so that's kind of, there were a lot of things happening at the same time, but we were able to get access to the actual documents. And after we got the documents, of course, it took me years to figure this out, but I got visited by 2 ICE agents, both at my home and my workplace, which had nothing to do. I was writing this for as a correspondent for Narco News, and I had a mainstream media job to pay the bills. And I had 4 kids at the time, so yeah, my kids are home, and it's like I committed some federal crime. But what they were trying to do is extract my sources. I don't know what they assumed, but they were trying to get me to give up my sources, and I just said, I'm not going to do that. And I said, I'm not going to talk anymore unless I can record this. And I turned on the recorder, and that's when it all ended. But then they went to my boss, tried to say I was, causing all these problems, and were trying to get me fired. It didn't work, because the publisher I had at the time, I knew a long time, he stood behind me. But the upper ranks of the media company is another matter. So, because this costs them money, and this is it comes down to that, and or could have, and it was not something they wanted to be involved in. So I had been shut down a long time from doing investigative reporting for similar reasons for that mainstream media chain, but that's why I started writing for Narco News. So it was like the saying I got from one of my buddies, actually Charles Bowden said this, who wrote Down by the Rivers. He's died in 2014, but we talked a lot, and he says, this tells me all I need to know about our business. Is he was saying this about Gary Webb, another person that dealt with investigative journalism involving multinational drug war operations. You can draw a paycheck every 2 weeks in this business, as long as you don't draw blood. And I think there's some truth to that. So if you're a journalist and you really want to do investigative reporting, unrestrained, follow the story where it goes, without regard to who is offended or who might see their interests, zapped, or advertising, or whatever it is that media companies worry about. You got to find a way to do it out on your own. In the case of Narco News, it was a nonprofit, funded by a nonprofit, took no advertising. I mean, there wasn't anyone else going to shut us down. That made us even more dangerous to them, and I think that's why they put the heat on us with sending the agents to my door.
I want to come back to this, but let me ask before we leave the Juarez drug cartel. I mean, you mentioned earlier that there's a leader named the leader of it's named Santiana Taveras, and you said they had the goods on him early on in this. So, but they wanted to get a bigger bust than they did. And so a lot of, so all these people died. There was a paid U.S. ICE informant who was part of the, running this house of death where people were killed, and, whatever. There was maybe many houses like this might be replicated, but you dig into this one. But I want to go back to Santian, who, like I said, you said they had the goods on him from day one. What actually happened to this guy? Did all their cover up and this and that, and keeping things secret, did that work for them? Were they able to make the big bust that they wanted to make?
In a word, no. I mean, they got Santian eventually. The original indictment had 5 or 6 murder charges and running a criminal enterprise, drug trafficking. But they had to drop all the murder charges once Sandy's letter came out, because the lawyer for Santian, took the screws to the prosecutors, and there's no way they're going to be able to get, because the murders all happened in Mexico, and so they basically dropped all the murder charges, and they cut a plea deal with them, and that's basically what came of it. They had him on drug trafficking, that was it, and those were charges they could have brought against them well before all these murders. They had done a sting operation on him and had that. So everything after that was thrown out because it was tainted. It's the fruit of the poisonous tree kind of stuff. And so they were able to get him to plead, and he's probably out this year.
So if I got this right, I mean, basically, even if you take the position that the ends will justify the means here, and that it was okay to have whatever these horrific things happen, which I can't imagine. It doesn't play out here because they didn't get any more than they could have gotten before the murders. So these murders were for no reason and under the watch of the immigration customs enforcement.
Arguably, the pushback from them when I talk to even agents to a degree, but definitely the cartel side, these murders would have happened anyway. These people were going to be killed by the cartel, whether ICE was involved or not. And that's the best defense they have. And there might be some truth to that, but I kind of drew the line, and I think Sandy the same way, is that any murder that's preventable, especially if you're operating from the premise that somehow we have a justice system, you have an obligation to prevent it. I mean, not every person murdered is unique. I mean, maybe they would have died, maybe someone else would have died, but you still, if your attitude is, who cares if they get murdered, and that's just what we're going to do, that getting a big case is worth 12 lives in Mexico, or I mean, literally the murder rate in Mexico is 3 times what it is here, fueled by this drug war that we are engaged in. And that's kind of what I was trying to show with the book, is that the drug war isn't solving anything. It's a circular, quagmire that we've been in for 40, 50 years that has only resulted in death, and both by drugs and by atrocities and murders and mass murders. I mean, it's like everyone involved benefits from the money that's thrown off by it, whether it's U.S. companies selling helicopters and radios or whatever to Mexico to fight the drug war, whether all the guns, most of the guns that the cartels use come from the U.S. There's a huge gun trade into Mexico, where guns are basically illegal. You can buy a small, maybe, gun to go hunting, but they have very restrictive gun laws. Yet guns are all over Mexico now and they're U.S. guns, and it's lucrative. You can sell a gun for 5-6 times what it costs you here. And so you have guns going south. You have all the cash thrown off this business. Huge, it's a multi-billion-dollar business, and it greases palms on both sides of the border. And that's all going south and getting laundered through the U.S. financial and global financial system. We just had another big bank busted for paid a fine for money laundering. Right? It was cartel money they were laundering. And the banks never go to jail, of course. They get fined, and they hire someone from DOJ to monitor them. And a lot of times those people that are hired to monitor them are the same ones. In this case, like the people head of DOJ when House of Death happened, initially was at John Ashcroft, and then Johnny Sutton worked for him. Johnny Sutton was good buddies with George Bush. He's from Texas. He was like an all-star baseball player for the Longhorns, and kind of got, brought up the ranks because they're all good old boys. Well, Ashcroft and Sutton went into practice together after the House of Death case, after they left government. And one of the big contracts they got was working for the Department of Justice to monitor this very kind of thing, banks that laundered money. So it's just like everybody makes money. So it's never going to stop. On both sides of the border, the corruption is a little different, but it's all about money and power.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because this goes to it's Ashcroft and Sutton and their subordinates are part of this cover up, or things that they either knew or should have known, things that may have crossed their desks, and you speculate in the book how high up it might have went, and then you give actual.
I don't even have to speculate. It was in court testimony. At least after the fact, it went as high as the Attorney General, Ashcroft. And then, James Comey was the guy running DOJ right under him day to day. So Comey knew. They all show up in an email. The one that talked about, making sure this stays out of the press, and we're going to slap Sandy for this. I mean, Comey was on that email, not Ashcroft.
Well, talk a little more about that. What did the email actually say? And how did this cover up actually work, and what was the motivation behind it?
Well, here it came out of Maine. The original email came out of Maine Justice, and then later Karen Taney, head of DEA, got involved replying. But the two main points of the email is that we got to avoid this. They were very worried about it hitting the media, so they were doing everything they can to not make sure it didn't hit the media, which it never really did, other than us. And then also, you know, for lack of a better word, they didn't use the word retaliate, but it was retaliate against Sandy to shut him up. And then they launched an internal investigation of what happened, which was never supposed to be public. To this day, I haven't been able to get it. It exists, but they won't release it. It was called a JAT report, but they interviewed like 40 people involved with all of this mess. And that was Deep Six. So their goal was to mend the tensions between the agencies best they could, because DEA and ICE were at each other's throats, especially in El Paso. And then, keep it all in house. Don't air our dirty laundry. This would be, obviously devastating politically. It was an election year at the time, 2004. So yeah, that's what was going on the US side. And the Mexican side, they had their own, battles. And I can only tell you that they didn't really take action either to expose this, but who knows what quid pro quos happen at that level. I could only speculate, but the long and short of it is it got covered up pretty effectively, and the fact that I got to write this book is evidence of that, right? So and nobody knows about it really. There are sporadic headlines here and there, but they're all focused on the drug war pornography is what I call it, which is the violence, like who got murdered. They don't look at the bigger structure of why this is happening, or who was involved in the cover up and why, and what the costs of that cover up are, and how this is not unusual in the drug war as it's set up now. This is more common than not. And it's just a mess. And until we kind of examine the premise of the drug war and the pretense that it is, and pull it apart and start thinking about ways to reform this, we're going to have these continuing problems. And I would argue it fuels the migrant, the refugee crisis or immigrant crisis, whatever you want to call it, people that are fleeing. And because this is happening not just in Mexico, so, a lot of the drugs and these same militarization and investigative tactics happen south of Mexico. So we have, Venezuela has been turned into a giant narco state, right? That's part of the violence fueled there. And so you have these mass waves of immigration fleeing the violence, which in large part is caused by the US guns coming south and the drug war. All the drugs being consumed in the US creates the cash for the guns, and the guns go south, creates the rivalries for the cash and the violence that fuels the immigration. It's a vicious cycle. And
Yeah.
nobody looks at it other than to say, we got a big dust, we busted a kingpin, and it's going to end the drug war and put a dent in the organized crime. And it doesn't. It just makes it worse. It's not a good strategy.
Well, what I get from your book and from what you've said here today is we had this really horrific thing where the United States government, through one of its informants, was part of was involved in murder, and that there was one person who went through channels and called it out, and Sandy, who wrote this letter that you got a hold of. And the fact that you got a hold of it and it was published sent a whole circle of cover up, and the cover up. I'm trying to figure out why didn't it seems like people. I've read the book. It seems like people's careers were enhanced by being involved in the cover up as opposed to doing what Sandy did, which is just calling it out and saying, look, this is what happened and let's deal with it. Is that right?
Yeah,
or?
that's objectively, yeah, that's what happened. We can get into the reasons. There a lot of people could dissect it different ways, but basically the way I look at it is the cover up is the norm, because these are like, kind of networks of people that move through government that have different or are part of government, like, agent, like law enforcement, DEA commanders or whatever, that have no incentive to air the dirty laundry because it hurts their budgets, it hurts their careers, blah, blah, blah. So they have every incentive to cover this stuff up. They're very good at it. And very few consequences or passing the buck, like blaming it on some arcane thing that has nothing to do with it. So there's many strategies to do it, but there's no incentive built into government to expose corruption when it's in or I don't know what you want to call this stuff. Is it corruption or is it just like a complete lack of moral and ethics or whatever, that you're okay with murder, even though it's not, you didn't technically break the law because people got murdered in Mexico. It's not against US law, but it's still murder. And so that's what's, and you don't want, so they're in the US media is somewhat complicit in this too, because like I said, I couldn't write this stuff for a mainstream publication. It still hasn't really been explored at all by a mainstream publication, other than to say, kind of the high points. There was this house of death and an informant was involved, but they make it sound like it was a one-off and they don't really get into the tighter relationships that were involved. So that's the problem I see, that, most of the time, if you're going to report corruption or inside the federal government anyway, and I think it's similar all the way down the ranks, state and local, especially in law enforcement, you pay a price for it. Serpico didn't turn out, his life didn't turn out better for blowing the whistle on corruption in the New York police force, right? Got him a bullet. And did it really solve the underlying corruption problem in the New York Police Department? Hell no, at least not at the top, because since then you've had, even now you've got police commanders who have been arrested or accused of corruption. So this is the problem. There's no incentive for corruption to be exposed. The amount of money flowing through the drug war, the amount of incentives to get headlines or make cases, it all feeds into a need to cut corners at times, because it's not a clean thing at all. It's very morally ambiguous. No one has a white hat when you get in the middle of it. And you don't want that out there. You want a sanitized version of the drug war. We're winning it. We're stopping the drugs. And, we're going to put more money in it, more militarize the border, more militarize everything more, because that's the solution. And, people buy it. And people read the stories, you got these headlines. So it's all kind of a self-fulfilling pretense that is really hurting the country more than helping it.
Yeah. So let me ask you this then. I mean, it's like we're, the war on drugs, was declared by Richard Nixon in, I think the early 70s. I'm not sure, maybe, but it's, and there was other stuff before that, but, we've had many presidents since then. When you were covering this, George Bush was president of the United States. And since then, we've had Obama, Trump, and Biden. Has there been, is this just something that's in place, as regardless of who's president of the United States or who's the head of Homeland Security? Has there been any changes, or has this basically just been the status quo for some time now?
Well, I think that's a hard question to answer succinctly, because, the dynamics of the drug war have changed since, the time I covered, or since the House of Death. But I mean, at least some of the players, like the big cartels back then, for the most part, most of them have been, broken apart. And the drug war strategy in Mexico and Latin America, there's a whole other side to it besides the U.S. law enforcement. There's the intelligence community and how that operates, because overseas, that's who really calls the shots more than the law enforcement. So there's the thing with the borders, there's so many competing interests and so much variations in the corruption that evolve, that it's hard to say like these specific facts are the same as they were back then. But what I can say is the basic, if you step back from it, no, nothing's changed. I mean, the dynamics are exactly the same. And what does the president do? They get in for 4 years. Even if they want to address this, you can't fix this problem in 4 years. I don't think you fix it in 8 years. You would need, real buy-in, and I don't even have the solution to it. All I can tell you is it's happening, and the drug war is not working. And I'd argue it's making things worse. And we need to take a stab at changing some of these dynamics and how we approach it. The kingpin strategy is a joke. And I've talked to people in Mexico, what they think. Now, this is telling you how it affects international. This is some of them. They think the U.S. policy is actually, because Mexico is a partner, but it also, trades with other nations and has at times more leftist presidents than the business interests in the United States, which drive a lot of this policy. Let's be honest, both the corrupt part and the normal, like the above board part, that they they see the violence as kind of a governor on administrations that they think are going too far. So, you arrest a major kingpin, it sparks violence in Mexico, just as the new president's coming on board, trying to take a new tack in how they deal with the cartels. It's a very difficult, international problem, right? But that is the perception in Mexico. And how do you argue that when you have a case like the House of Death, where we did let murder happen, that we're okay with high rates of violence in Mexico because it's in our national security interests, business interests, whatever. And, the president has a lot of power, but they don't have complete power in this country, as you know. So you got Congress, you got the courts, and you got very powerful lobbyists and business interests. So, the only way I see a fix for it is if there was some kind of social movement that actually started, pushing some power up from the bottom, from the people up to these higher ranks that have been, for lack of a better word, corrupted by this drug war and in this vicious cycle we're never going to get out of unless they get a fucking kick in the ass to realize this is not good for us down here on the ground. We live this. You guys make the money on it. It's not right.
Well, you're on the right podcast because our Fight Back Radio listeners are ass kickers. So,
well, I mean, I mean that in a, I'm about social movements in a sense that they have, they're organized and they're focused toward positive change, not like, like the social movements we see from the Trump side, which are,
no, of course.
But we need, because that wouldn't work anyway. That would be counterproductive. We need basically a nonviolent mass social movement to put some pressure where it's needed to change the dynamics of this drug war, which is highly linked to the gun trade and to immigration. And one big thing is we can reform our gun laws and stop all these guns from going south. That's one big plus we could focus on to collapse some of this bullshit. But we're not even doing that.
Yeah. Let me pivot a little bit here. So I know I want to go back to talking about journalism a little bit because I know you've done a deep dive in this book, Dispatches from the House of Death. And, you're whatever by, corporate standards, you're a legit journalist. You got your master's degree in journalism, maybe more. I'm probably missing some things. When I met you, you were working for the Milwaukee Business Journal, and you were the editor-in-chief of the San Antonio Business Journal at the time you were doing this work. But at the same time, you've always had this. You've mentioned narco news, and when I first met you, you were working for. You were working not for you weren't getting paid, I don't believe, but for the Shepherd or Shepherd Express in Milwaukee, and had these like alternative news sources where you could get out your things that were more difficult to publish in the mainstream or corporate media. And so it seems like a frustrating situation where for a journalist, but also for readers that are trying to learn the truth about what's going on in the world, and really to have an investigative journalism. Could you talk a little bit about that, and maybe advice you have for people that want to learn more things, or people that are maybe a young journalist who wants to do real journalism and not just reprint press releases?
Well, the media environment, even since the time I started writing for Narco News, is fractured even more, right? So mainstream media doesn't have the same power that it used to, and there's a lot of startups, and there's the whole social media world, and then there's just the ability to publish on multiple platforms, whether it's Patron or Medium or your own, actually. And that's the whole Substack phenomena. So it is evolving. Media always does. But the one thing we learned at Narco News, and I think it's very true, that in the U.S. Very little attention is paid to international news or news in other countries. But one thing with Mexico that definitely worked, when we were writing, we couldn't get mainstream coverage in the US, but one of the things we knew would happen is we would, because we translated our articles. So I'd say, bilingualism, being a monolingual journalist, I am, nowadays is definitely a drawback. You want more than one language, but we would publish in Spanish because we had people that translate them. It would get picked up by the Mexican press. And because it got picked up by Proceso or one of the major Mexican outlets, it forced the US media to pay attention to it, at least to some degree. So there's a lot of ricochet journalism you have to play to get the word out. But it is, if you're a young journalist getting in this field, I mean, it's changed. You got to be an expert in podcasting and video and in writing and in social media. And I think that kind of spreads you out so thin that you never, it's very difficult to produce content if you're constantly writing 5-minute screeds for all these social media channels. So I'd just say we need people to really focus on investigative journalism and do that work, which is completely separate and getting published. Once you have that work, then deal with the media channels and figure out the best way to get it out there, like talking about the story so people know about it through a podcast, or that's the only strategy that works. If you go to work for one of the major publications, you're going to be constrained by ultimately the owner of that publication, whether it's Jeff Bezos or whether it's Elon Musk, and what they want, at the end of the day. So you could fly under the radar only for so long, and I did, and then they zap you like a bug. So, and if you have no other place to go, you're done. You end up buckling in and writing the same screed they tell you to write. Or once you're constantly worried you're crossing some line they created that they keep moving. And because you probably have kids or a mortgage or need a paycheck, as all of us do, that constrains a lot of journalism that would otherwise happen. And it didn't used to be that way. I mean, back in the heyday of journalism and print, when it was just dailies and they were competing with each other, it was a lot more, and that's why you could have had the Watergate investigation. You could never have that today, in my opinion. It'd be very difficult to have that kind of impact with an investigative piece. So there's no magic bullet. You got to find a way, to get the journalism done that you believe needs to be done. And sometimes that means, putting your job at risk to do it. But not stupidly, because one thing I learned in covering when I went south of the border, like into Mexico, into especially in the indigenous areas, they were more worried about your camera or about your notebook, your ability, your tools for reporting than they were you. I mean, they were very blunt about it. The only reason you're here and valuable is because you can get the story out to other people about what's really happening here. And, it's not about you. It's not about your name, your byline, your ego. I mean, you could be anybody. We don't care. We just want to make sure that the story of what's happening here gets out to a broader audience. And I think more journalists have to think of it that way. It's become an influencer, somebody's name, and you're not supposed to be famous as a journalist. Actually, it gets in the way of the work. Because if you're famous as a journalist, there's nowhere you can go without being spotted, without being, you can't do investigative journalism if everyone knows, you're honest about it. You got to tell your sources you're a journalist. But, there are places where you showing up can cause harm to a community because of what you say or write as a journalist, or because of the fact they see you talking to a journalist, right? So these are all things that we're completely oblivious to. I was, until I started reporting in other countries. And I think we have to think about things that way. We have to, our journalism has to be for the right reasons. And my reason has always been to report news, and to walk in step with the people I come from, which is, I'm a working class kid. I never aspired to be a Bezos or a Musk. I was never on my, and it isn't now. I wouldn't be happy as those people. I just couldn't compromise those parts of my working class values to do that. So that's who I write for. That's what my writing is about. It's about informing the people I knew who are in my social, circle, if you will, my class, if you want to use those terms, so that they understand what's going on from the perspective of somebody that's writing for them and about what impacts them and about them. And we call that authentic journalism. We didn't coin that term. That came out of Mexico. That is called walking with the people. Right? You do your journalism for the people, not for the power. Power comes from the bottom up, not the top down. And we spend a lot of time in our journalism covering, and we have to a degree, Washington and New York and the business and Wall Street and all the people with power. But, they're not impacted by anything we write about them ultimately, because they control it all. So the only thing they're impacted by is by things coming out from the bottom that affect them, by mass movements, by mass social movements. That does influence them. And, we need to do that better in this country.
Well said. Well said. Thank you. We're winding down here, unfortunately, and I want to give you a chance if there's anything that we haven't covered here, or any points or anything you want to say to our Fight Back Radio listeners before we end the show. Now would be a good time to do that.
Yeah, I mean, if you just want more, I know we talked about a lot of big things. If you want to know more about the book, you're interested, there's a website. It's houseofdeath.org. And there's a dozen, at least, other articles not in the book that are about these subjects, the gun trade, the money laundering, whatever. And so you can check that out. It doesn't cost you anything. And I didn't write the book to make money, and clearly I'm not, but I did write it to be read. And so if you buy a copy and share it, do that. I just want people to know what I spent, basically 10, 15 years of my life investigating. And I think it's important to know what the facts are. And I did my best to report them honestly, and you'll know what I think, but the facts are the facts. I didn't alter them. And that's about it. And really, I think we if we can in this country, figure a way to foster more social movements around some of these issues. Unions are key to that, clearly, because they're great organizing the people already. But some of this has to happen in our neighborhoods. We just have to be more aware and of our own agency and of our own power collectively. We have a lot of power collectively, but individually we're easily isolated and picked off. And the last thing I'll say on that, the reason I survived this as a journalist wasn't because I was some magic, maneuvering through all these things. No, I had support. I had a team of journalists behind me with Narco News that were there through thick and thin. And you need that. You need to be surrounded by your allies to move forward.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So the book is Dispatches from the House of Death. We'll put in the show notes the website. And thank you for being our guest, Bill Conroy. Okay, so that was something a little bit different, having an investigative reporter on Fight Back Radio. Let us know what you think of that. Should we do more of this kind of thing, or you want to go back to having the leaders of the different campaigns, or we can do a mix of both? We're looking at doing another episode on a little more theoretical one too, because the last one was so popular. So let us know what your thoughts are, what you'd like to see on Fight Back Radio. You can reach us at richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. And now that's in the show notes as well if you want to look down there. Also, I just want to make a point. We're releasing this episode just a couple of days before the presidential election. So if you're listening to this a little bit after that, you may or may not know who the president who won the elections. But I know the Wednesday after the elections, there's going to be protests in cities across the United States, including here in Chicago, at federal plazas and on campuses and whatever, to demand that the people's agenda, but especially around the issue of Palestine, where both candidates have been equally repugnant in their views on this. And so, it's important that we stand with the Palestinian people, as people all over the world are, and continue to push to have justice in Palestine and justice in the Middle East. So if wherever you are, I encourage you to go out to a protest this Wednesday and, check out where the protests are. If you don't know where they are, send me an email at the address I just gave, and I'll try to hook you up with somebody in your area. But I think most our Fight Back Radio listeners are tuned into this. Also, I want to say that I mentioned on the last episode that I am being honored by the Freedom Road Socialist Organization in Chicago at their People's Struggle Awards dinner with the Pete Camerata Lifetime Achievement Award. And so I encourage people to come to this. I'd like to, of course, I appreciate the support, but I also would like to, see and talk to some of our Fight Back Radio listeners. In the show notes, we'll put where you can get your tickets for this. There's a Bitly email thing that or Bitly, whatever address you can look at. But it's going to be on December 14th at 4 o'clock at the Sixth Grace Presbyterian Church in Chicago. So I look forward to seeing some of you there, I hope. And so it's and then finally, I want to thank our production team, who does a fabulous job as always. Vince Olson, Shane Tremley, Natalie Pranis, and Dodd McColgan. And I'm Richard Berg for the entire Fight Back Radio team, saying until next time, all power to the people.